Tuesday's class, maybe spreading over onto the one after that. All these will be occupied with the second of the great Monster Boulders in the way on the pathway to the shining city of phenomenology, okay? Just to repeat my fantasy, I'm leading you the way, you guys are with me, you're my followers. You swallow the Kool-Aid, you're going to try to get to phenomenology. The first great Monster Boulder would be the theories people adopt to stop them from thinking phenomenologically and asking and pursuing answers to that great, fabulous question, what is it like to be this person? The second great boulder is a big one, it's ugly, it's dangerous, is the medical diagnostic perspective, or for short, what is called the medical model. Let me just give a thought or two before I launch into some more examples to try to really dramatize what I'm talking about. You have these fancy, immense diagnostic systems. A great many of them, dozens, have been proposed over the last 200 years. I'm just telling you, without proving it to you, that there's nothing to recommend one over the other. We could use one that was evolved in France 150 years ago. I think it would be just as good as the one we have now. There's no deep science or scientific advance of understanding that is really built into the modern innovations with diagnostic systems. It's arbitrary. I'm just saying that. You have to verify that. This, it's a good project, a historical study comparing all of these. It really opens your eyes to just how arbitrary these systems are. Now, I'm going to sound like I'm contradicting myself. It's not a bad thing, though, to learn the DSM. Like there's one now called DSM-4. It's about to be replaced. Another year, 9 months, it's going to be replaced. Substantially modified. That I can kind of see the point of studying it if you think of it as just a kind of summary of the sorts of things one sees in this field. Like the collection of human behaviors, experiences, things that people say and do. That abnormal psychology, psychopathology, the psychiatry has occupied itself with understanding. If you think of it as just a giant system that's a list of the signs of something going terribly wrong in human lives, there's nothing wrong with understanding and reading it. The problem becomes when you get these little clusters of co-occurring deviations, and then you name it, and then you reify the label and think that you've really put your finger on some actual objective illness, disorder, disease that exists inside a person, and whatever that person is doing is then seen as a set of symptoms emanating from that disease that you've imagined is inside. You've arrived at a place where you can't do phenomenology because what you look at is a symptom of the classification the person belongs to, the pigeonhole that they place themselves in. This thing about reifying the patterns of conduct, behavior, and experience that we study is the fatal error of the diagnostic system, because then you're working with concepts of disease, disorder, as something existing inside of a person, and it stops you from just asking real simply the question, the person is doing X. We need to understand what this X is within the world uniquely that this person experiences. So anyway, I'm going to give you a whole bunch of examples and kind of highlight the difference between a medical diagnostic viewpoint perspective and a phenomenological one. And the first one draws again on my case, Anna. It's brief and it's easy. You might remember my story of hit me, hit me, hit me. I told it on the first day in class. If not, please go. If you weren't here for the first day of class, go on the Sakai website. You will find a recording of that first class there. And it's a classic story of hit me that I used there. I used it to illustrate this in a simple example the operation of the phenomenological perspective. Somebody's doing something, and you inquire, and you inquire, and you inquire, and you search and search and search, and if you're lucky, you find out what it might mean, or does mean, within the world this person experiences. Especially important when the world that person is perceiving differs radically from the ordinary one we think we share with each other. And it certainly did with her. Had to do with the feeling of inner deadness, if you remember the story. Anyway, another part of that account was this. The affect on Anna's face during the long period, it lasted 8 weeks, 10 weeks, 12 weeks, I'm not even sure how many, but it seemed to me it was going on forever and ever, working with her as a therapist. And she was doing the same thing in the hospital when she was just in the hospital dealing with staff members and other patients there. Hit me, she was saying that. She had this look, this smile on her face that was perpetual. It was the weirdest looking thing you've ever seen. It did not look like a normal smile where your eyes crinkle up and the person shows the sign of happiness, but it was the affective expression of a smile that was there. And it was really hard to read. What in the world is this grinning? Hit me. I can't imitate it really, but I wish I could. I need to go into a big smile and then freeze it on my face, okay? Hit me. It was so weird. You almost couldn't stand to look at her. You said, oh, God, stop it. You're freaking me out. But she wouldn't stop. Hit me. Please, hit me. All right, so now there's the idea of the 4 A's of schizophrenia. Remember I was telling you last time in my little story about how I got called to produce them and couldn't do it and humiliated myself, whatever. But one of those A's was affect. And the specific thing about affect in schizophrenia is that the person shows inappropriate affect. And you can really even tell by the term that there's something the matter with it from a phenomenological point of view. Because who's to judge whether an affect is appropriate to the thought that accompanies it? But at least on the face of it, on the surface, there seemed to be a bizarre disconnect between the smile that Anna showed and the content of what she was saying, which was hit me. Pretty much any psychiatrist would have taken one look at this woman and pronounced this inappropriate affect that was unconnected to the content of what she was saying and thinking. And therefore, and what do we do with the presence of inappropriate affect? It's a symptom. It's one of the little clusters that sometimes happens in people. The other 3 A's, the associational disturbance, the ambivalence disturbance, all black and all white, all good and all bad, and the so-called autism, a private reality of hallucinations and delusions. So it's one of those symptoms. So an inappropriate affect is considered to be really one of the cardinal symptoms of schizophrenia. So if you're showing that and nothing else, a person might be suspicious that's the category you belong to. But phenomenology doesn't look at it that way. You're not looking for a cluster of co-occurring deviations from the golden man inside the globe floating in the men on hooks. By the way, I put a cool question of the week number 4 up. Please go to it. I gave a link. There's also one on resources to my little essay about the golden globe and the men on hooks. And what I ask you to do in my cool question of the week is to read my essay. It's short. It's 4 or 5 paragraphs long. It just tells the story of the lecture last time, more in a funny fantasy of the men hanging on hooks. But it asks you to speculate on the meaning of the image, because I created that image almost in a daydream, almost a night dream. And I don't really understand exactly why it came to me as it did. Why did I have the great diagnosticians of history and psychiatry hanging from hooks? Why weren't they just standing there like this? But it was compelling to me. No, these guys are hanging from hooks. And they're just floating there over a sea of unwashed humanity. That's you and me, going about all the weird stuff that we do. The stuff that fits the ideal and the stuff that doesn't fit the ideal at all. But what I've asked you to do is kind of offer conjectures in the cool question of the week as to why the fantasy has the form it does, and is there a hidden meaning in terms of the critique of the diagnostic system. And I was thinking about this question as I came down here this morning in my car, and an idea came to me. Isn't it awfully weird that the people who are classifying and analyzing and diagnosing human weirdness, mental illness, are themselves engaged in such a weird behavior of hanging from hooks and watching people? Now, another way to put that is, isn't it just a really weird occupation to start with? To be classifying and diagnosing and reifying and arranging people into these nice little categories and comfortable little boxes that we can place them in? Is it possible that the most disturbed behavior that is represented in the picture is not what the weird guys down below in the pit are doing, which is a symbol of you and me. It's the actual diagnosing activity itself, is itself a sign of some kind of a disturbance and disorder. That would be the kind of thing I want to hear from you. You know, why are they on hooks? And also, what are the hooks attached to up above? Are there weird demons playing with them like puppets? I used this once before in this class as a question for people asking people what they wanted to think of it. One of my favorite answers, now you won't be able to use this if it occurs to you, is actually the men on hooks are bait. And they're being like lowered down from above by drug companies because they can give the prescriptions for all the drugs to help the people down below get rid of their depressions and control their thoughts and get rid of their hallucinations and improve their moods and all like that. Who knows? But it's really a question that asks you to fantasize. But I look at it and read everything you say. I want your fantasy to be, though, in the spirit of the critique of the diagnostic model, because that's the purpose of the whole thing. Anyway, back to my story of Anna. So we have a young woman. She is exhibiting one of the primary 4 A's of schizophrenia, inappropriate affect, an apparent disconnect between content of thought and speech on the one side, hit me, and the look on her face. The phenomenology doesn't think that way. Phenomenology says this: anything and everything a person is doing, saying, how they're performing, conducting themselves, what they're feeling, what the images they're having, is embedded in an ongoing world of experience. And to understand its meaning is to see where it fits into that world. So even this smile must be part of something. Now, I don't know for certain what her smile meant, but I know this, that it was there perpetually during hit me. And when finally she and I had a dialogue in writing where she could say physical pain is better than spiritual death, and I could tell her I now understood what she'd been trying to say to me, I saw that smile melt away. And instead there was a look of immense despair on her face instead. So a clue as to what the smile might be is given by the conditions not only of it being so perpetual, but also of it disappearing at the moment that we began to communicate more deeply about the inner deadness that she had been suffering with, but no one seemed to have ever known or recognized for what it was. And I realized she was trying to tell me about it and trying to get me to do something, to make her feel something that would make her alive, not dead. So, what would be a hypothesis? You can't know anything for certain in phenomenology. It's always a hypothesis, always a conjecture. But you try to come up with ideas that fit the material that lies before you, that coheres with everything in the case. So I'm just going to offer an idea without saying this is the golden truth necessarily. I had the idea I'm about to tell you based on looking at a drawing that Anna made for me, and I've reproduced the drawing up here on the blackboard. This is almost a carbon copy. This is what it looked like. One day as I was sitting there, this is after Hit Me was over, and the smile was now gone. But it's in the immediate aftermath. It's only 2 or 3 months later. I worked with her for 35, 40 years altogether, so that we were very early in our work together. She one day asked me, she says, "You want to know the structure of the human mind, George?" And I said, "Yes, I would like to know it." She says, "I'm going to show it to you." I said, "Okay." And she took out a piece of paper and drew this following diagram. This is a diagram of the universal structure of the human mind. It's your mind, my mind, her mind, everyone's mind. And you would be surprised to know how often very severe psychological disturbances they lead a person to need to build portraits and pictures of the structures of their mind. They're like little mini personality theorists. Mental hospitals are packed with personality theorists. And it gives one pause to see how often people are occupied with trying to diagram, understand, formulate the structure of the human mind. What does it say about the people whose whole careers are that? That is my whole career. That's what I do, too. Madness and genius, madness and normality, the boundaries of these things slip away from us again and again and again. And we need to see the common ground that we share with people. Anyway, she was offering me a picture, a universal model of the mind. And this was it. It was a picture of a person's head as if viewed from the side, kind of like a cutaway slice or something. And it was a woman's face, and there was an arrow pointing to the exterior boundary of her face itself, and the label was dead surface. Okay? So she's saying her face, the skin, the features and all, That was the dead surface of this person's being. But there was a darkened area at the center of the brain, and it had two phrases with labels attached: soul cave and heart cave. Okay, those are the same thing, basically. And I remember looking at it and thinking, oh my God, she's just like the great personality theorists. You know, Freud diagrams the structure of the human mind, but if you take my personality class and read Faces in a Cloud, my first book with Stollerow, you see how the great personality theorists, when they derive the universal structure of the mind, they produce a symbolic image that completely mirrors who they were, what their personality was. This is Anna's story here. So I see this not as a universal, but as a very particular picture of the universal involving a projection of her own being onto people widely and pervasively, okay? And what it shows is a split between whatever it is that lies inside the heart cave or soul cave. It would be her heart or her soul. And the external self, the face that she shows to the world, is only a surface, and it's dead, not alive, okay? So this reminds me, you know, so where is Anna? Well, how do we understand this idea of the dead surface? Well, now I'm drawing on R.D. Laing and Divided Self, and you'll read all about it a little bit later in the semester when you get to that part of your reading. But he has the notion that what can happen to a person in severe ontological insecurity, that's the terror of annihilation, that a split is sometimes developed as a solution in which the outer self is a kind of false self, that the face, the mask that is shown to others, but one is not oneself engaged in that, one's not contained in that. One instead splits off into an inner true self that exists on some other plane. That would be the soul cave and heart cave. I don't know if you guys remember the poem that Anna gave me. It all came down on me, but I hid in my special closet, but no one was around to report me missing. That's the retreat into the soul cave and heart cave. Her poetry, her imagery, it all kind of converged around themes like that and matches up real closely and interestingly to Laing's story. And Laing also talks about what happens to the true self of a person when it hides away from all sustaining human connection. It kind of vanishes, volatilizes, dissolves, disappears. That's the territory of Anna's thing. So what about the smile? What is a smile really? If we translate a smile into words, it's the word yes that it speaks. A frown is something else. There can be fearful looks that say something else altogether. But a smile is a kind of yes to the object. And the false self, as Laing understands it, and I think as it appeared in Anna's life and life history, is a kind of mask of compliance and cooperativeness. It's a little bit hard to explain, but I had the sense with Anna that I could get her to do anything. If I told her to jump out the window, she'd jump. If I told her to take off all her clothes, we're having sex right now, she would have not hesitated. Off they would have come, and there we could go. You know, I'm obviously not going to do that, but it was a sense that, you see, the smile says yes, 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 anything, anything. Make of me anything you want. I'll be anything you want. Imagine me as something, and I'll be that for you. But I'm not really involved in whatever you imagine me as being. I'm not really myself present in whatever behavior or conduct you try to engage me to perform for you. But I'll be everything, but I'll act like I am. Where am I? Well, we go back to the diagram now. I'm hidden away. I'm not involved. You're not seeing me. You're not even talking to me, is what she would say. That's another part of the case. I'm just telling you all these things. I don't know what it sounds like to you, but a little bit later, she came to me and said that she was really frightened because I hadn't seemed to realize that I'd never spoken a word to her, never had a single conversation with her at all. That was a reference, again, to the idea that she was in a special closet, a soul cave, a heart cave, and that I seemed not to know that. I seemed to think I was talking to someone as I talked to her. But that someone was absent rather than present, and I seemed not to recognize the absence. And you have to recognize the absence, then the presence starts to be there a little bit more. So that may sound confusing to you. Anyway, I'm coming to an idea about the smile. I think the smile expresses the attitude of the false self of compliance and cooperation. She wasn't being entirely compliant and cooperative, though, because she was saying, hit me, hit me, hit me. But that was a cry from the inner self, demanding to be recognized and demanding and begging and pleading to be made to feel something, to cross that great divide. So I see the smile then as expressive of the compliance that is split off profoundly from a feeling of authenticity of the real self, the true self, the genuine self that exists in a separate line. So that's the experiential context in which the smile had meaning. And then it made sense to me that when we finally communicated and she could tell me about the deadness and I could understand that they hit me, yes, well, of course she wants to feel alive. So pain is better than that. She wants to feel something. She's asking me to do something. That was a deep communication. And the divide separating her outer false self, her dead surface, from the inner true self in the heart cave, soul cave, or special closet, whatever the specific images, words are, that had closed. The link had appeared. There was an actual feeling of somebody gets me, understands me, gets me in a good way. And then the smile disappeared. Okay? It makes sense to me that that would be true. So the last thing in the world I would want to do is I see what looks like an inappropriate affect. Check mark, 4 A's of schizophrenia. We're all done then as soon as you get the person diagnosed. No. Phenomenology says whatever it is there, it's embedded in a context. We need to find out what that is. That will help us figure the meaning of it out. And if we can get there, that will help tell us what we might do for this person that might conceivably make a difference to the crisis or catastrophe that they're in. Anna was in an ongoing catastrophe and had been for many, many years. And the nature of the catastrophe was lost on her entire environment. No one was around to report me missing. From her point of view, no one had ever seen that she had disappeared from life. And wouldn't you say that if a person has disappeared from life and gone into a special closet and is engaging in all kind of behavior that people diagnose her and try to treat her and medicate her and all of this stuff, but no one gets it that she disappeared, and no one gets it when they talk to her, they're not really reaching her, doesn't it make sense to think that if somebody's going to really help her, they have to get that? They have to reach that other part of her. They have to become aware of what's happened. That's phenomenology. Psychiatry is anti-phenomenological. It doesn't want to dwell with that. It's too hard. It's too time-consuming. It doesn't. And when you break through, miracles don't necessarily occur, but you might take care of a certain pattern of behavior that's been taking place, like this thing, hit me. So I just give that as a single example. Let me make sure I didn't miss anything. Mask of compliance, true self hidden within, make me what you want, blah, da, 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 da. Okay? So the inappropriate affect is not seen as part of a list of co-occurring characteristics. It's seen as an expression of an important feature of a very deeply divided world. That's all. That's phenomenology for you. Now, I could be wrong. Maybe there was some other reason for that, and my hypothesis is off base. That's okay. It's still a phenomenological hypothesis. But if you take it and just fit it into the category system, you put a wall between yourself and this person. Because you've diagnosed them schizophrenic, but you haven't even understood the most basic thing of all, that they're not present. Okay? What could be more basic than that? Now let me move on to a second example, but it's the same point being made in a series of cases, okay? I have to really kind of psych myself into this story because it involves a dinner conversation I had years ago, and it's very vivid. The whole story goes back 25 years or something, but my memory is, if I can make it work, is fantastic for certain things. 99% of things are lost in a fog of forgetfulness. I'm famous for calling my memory a forgettery rather than a memory. I forget so many things. It frightens me how many. But there are certain stories that glow, certain events that are just vivid as if yesterday, photographic. This story actually appears in Abyss of Madness, I think in chapter 6, I think. The chapter called The Unbearable and Unsayable. You'll read that later in the semester. Don't worry about that now. But I don't give all the extravagant details in the book that I will give you guys now. It's a conversation I had with a friend. In my book, I presented it as having been a patient of mine. That's false. The book conceals, disguises, distorts, and kind of messes with the truth. But the deep truth in the book is preserved. But I try to protect identities and whatever and all. This is someone I was involved with at a certain point, as a friend only. Anyway, a long story short, I'm working my mind to work back in time. One evening, I went out with a girlfriend and my wife, and the girlfriend's girlfriend, another woman. to a Mexican restaurant in Perth Amboy, New Jersey. I love Mexican food. I was raised on Mexican food in Tucson, Arizona, and Carlsbad, New Mexico. I used to save my lunch money up all week. I'd take a whole week of lunch money, $1.25, and just go over on Friday. I'd starve the other 4 days. I'd be dizzy. I'd so hungry. But I knew on Friday I would go over to the Mexican restaurant and have a giant combination plate. It was worth it. Okay, to do it. So I'm a Mexican food nut. So we went to the Mexican restaurant that had gotten highly recommended with these 3 people, my wife and the other 2. And I remember what I ordered, and I like to tell, for some reason, it helps me evoke the memory to tell this part of the story. I ordered blue crab enchiladas. It was one of the worst decisions I have ever made in my life. The food tasted good. It was oddly sweet, but I think it's supposed to be a little bit sweet. But later that night, either because of the blue crab enchiladas or because of the conversation we had, I became sicker than I remember being in my whole life ever. It was so bad. It was food poisoning or something. It was puking and diarrhea, and it was coming out of my ears and everything else like that. It was like playing musical toilets. You're on the toilet, and you put your head down and puke and sit back in, and diarrhea, spinning, and finally just collapsing in a heap on the bathroom floor and having a conversation with God. God, take me now. So bad, I just want to be dead, not alive. Have you ever had a bad thing like that? Most of us have had a little bit of that. And I've had a lot of experiences of getting sick and food poisoning and too much booze and end up puking. What a friend of mine used to call worshiping the porcelain princess. Meant kneeling before a toilet and puking your guts out. Anyway, I was doing more than just that, but I was worshiping her big time that night. So anyway, it really helped me get back into it, okay? So we're sitting there at dinner, and I'm wolfing down these tortillas and chips and hot sauce and blue crab enchiladas. And the conversation turned to the health status of the woman, my friend's girlfriend. I just met her that night. She was herself a psychotherapist. We're all a bunch of therapists, not my wife, but the other girlfriend and her friend. And her daughter, who lived in a western state, had recently been put in a psychiatric hospital. So I said, oh God, I'll call her Linda, the friend. It's not her name, but I said, well, Linda, geez, I'm really sorry to hear about that. How old is your daughter? 22 years old. I said, really? What's her story? What happened to her anyway? She said, well, she just recently became massively, massively depressed, and no one was able to understand what caused this. I said, really? The depression just came on her, like completely? She said, yes, like a meteor from space. She had been doing incredibly well in a life that was successful in every respect. And all of a sudden, for no external reason at all, her mood had collapsed. She'd gone to bed and been unable to get up anymore. She lost all her energy. Her whole capacity for exercising any personal initiative in any way, planning anything for herself, was gone. She said that she felt dead. She felt like there was a heavy weight on top of her, keeping her from moving, and that she had no future, and she was depressed. Okay, that was the story. I said, well, geez. Every depression I've ever studied has a basis to it. There must have been something that happened. Are you sure there didn't something happen? Maybe you don't know about it. She said, no, I'm certain. My daughter nothing's gone wrong in her life. Her life has been perfect. I said, well, tell me about your daughter's life, just for my benefit. She said, well, my daughter's been, she's beautiful, physically just a beautiful young woman. She had been a stellar student all the way through her academics in every grade, high school. She went to a fancy women's college with full scholarship support because she was such an A+ student. Had a magna or summa cum laude graduation record when she graduated from college as an architecture major. She had actually been accepted into an apprenticeship with a well-established architect that was supposed to start later that year. In her senior year of college, which had been just a year and a half before we were having this conversation, she met a young man, a young chemist who was completing a doctorate in chemistry, and began to go out with him, and they fell deeply in love with each other. And they decided to get engaged and be married. And just very recently, they had set a wedding date and begun to go through the process of planning the ceremony. And this is when the disaster struck. Suddenly the bottom fell out. of her mood, and she couldn't function anymore and didn't know what it was. And I said, really? I said, that's incredible, because if everything is going well, you expect a person to feel better, not worse. But if they're feeling worse, there has to be some reason behind what it might be. No, George, there's really not. And I said, well, are you sure? Because maybe you don't know the story. You can't assume that you know. Sometimes people have things happening to them, or they've done things they're keeping secret. And I began to wonder if maybe she had a pregnancy or something, and maybe an abortion or something. I was just making things up out of my own mind. I didn't even say this to the mother. Maybe there's some disaster that's taken place personally that she's concealing that is causing this depression. The mother said, I'm sure that's not right. And I said, well, what's happening to her in the hospital? She said, well, it's a medical hospital and it's a research unit. And I said, tell me about that. She said that the daughter had been taken into a research program for the treatment of a hitherto unrecognized mental illness that she seemed to be a prime example of. I said, really? I had no idea what this was going to be. She said, yeah. I said, what is that mental illness? She said, it's acute endogenous depression of young adulthood. Now, let me back up for just a moment. Classically, depression has been divided into two categories. You might not find these terms in the current DSM, but they're used commonly enough and used to be used a lot more, and the idea is still there. Serious depressions that people can fall into are categorized into exogenous versus endogenous. And what that exogenous means that it comes from, the genesis comes from something from outside. Sometimes this is called reactive depression. Something happens in the person's actual life situation, like loss of a loved one, failure in some project that has been pursued for a long time, some terrible disappointment in someone. There's a shock, a trauma, and the depression unfolds as a reaction to it. That's exogenous depression. Ex means outside in Latin. Endogenous, on the other hand, would be a depression where there is no external precipitating event. The thing just suddenly comes upon a person. It's not tied to any specific sequence of events that has taken place in the person's life. It arises from, endogenous means the genesis from within. And usually when the concept of endogenous depression is used, people think of it as being neurobiological in nature, that something has happened in a person's brain, something in the neurochemistry has triggered the depression, rather than it being an emotional reaction to an outside event. Okay? So anyway, there were two young medical researchers in the medical school and in the affiliated hospital in the city in the western states, who were researchers and had proposed this new category, acute endogenous depression of young adulthood. Acute means sudden onset, by the way. So when you say it's an acute condition, it means the person was doing fine, all of a sudden, boom, something happened. Okay. Anyway, they were researching it. And so they were taking young adulthood, that means the early 20s, basically, people like 19, 20, 21, 24, 25 years old, that age range. And they had a number of other cases where people would fall into terrible depressions, but they seem unassociated with any of the standard precipitating events of depression, like loss, disappointment, failure. There are other things that can do it, but you can see that there's really nothing there at all. She seemed to be a prime example of that, because look at her life. Stellar academics, incredibly popular, brilliant, bright future, both a future of marriage and hopefully family. She wanted to have children. There was no reason she wouldn't be able to. Her husband was a genuinely nice guy. I was prepared to believe that. There wasn't anything horrible going on, said the mother. The daughter herself said the depression had hit her from space. It wasn't about anything. She just couldn't move anymore, is what it was. So I just remember being dumbfounded as I'm slurping down this poisonous food with all the bacteria in it that I'm getting ready to go for the trip to the moon later that night. Tell me more about this. I said, I'll tell you something, Linda. In all my experience as a clinician, I have never seen a depression that wasn't associated with something really difficult that happened in the person's life. Sometimes there can be a delay in the reaction. It might not be recent. I don't really know. She said, no, my daughter, I'm telling you, she is the light of my life. Everything has been just fine with her. I said, really? It's just hard to believe. And then she said this. I remember the words, they just came out, and I thought, uh-oh, here it comes. Well, there was one thing. In this perfect life. I can't tell you how many times I've had this happen. You're talking to somebody and say, no, my childhood was perfect. No, everything was good. Or you're talking to the parents, talking about the childhood. Everything is perfect, just good. Well, there was one thing. Then you know, here it comes, all right? People are so strange. I said, well, what was that one thing? This blemish on an otherwise perfect life. And I was prepared to believe it was perfect in all these other ways. There was a horrible, indescribably painful, impossible tragedy that had taken place when this young woman was 12 years old. And it involved the death of her father. And I said, well, tell me about the death. Its circumstances, its detail, and then its aftermath in terms of what the girl reacted to. Because, so often with bad depression, you see loss as a huge factor. And the loss can be remote in time, but still be very deeply involved in the depression that's there. I immediately started suspecting, well, this is probably what this depression's about. Here's the story. One fine evening, my friend Linda, her daughter, 12 years old, and her son, who was 14 years old, 2 years older, and their father sat down for a Italian dinner at the kitchen table. Spaghetti and meatballs. I happen to remember the exact plate it was that they had prepared. But guess what? They didn't have any Italian bread. Who's going to have a spaghetti dinner without Italian bread? You have to have it. You just got to. Otherwise, it's still good, but what are you going to have? Wonder bread instead? No, you got Italian bread. So the father said, I'll run down to the 7-Eleven. They have Italian bread loaves down there. And that's all I'll do. So he got in the car, took off, didn't come back. 20 minutes goes by, half an hour goes by. They're getting really anxious, wondering what's happened. They look outside, they don't see anything. Finally, like an hour and a half later, a policeman arrives. And what had happened is he picked up the Italian bread, but as he drove out of the parking area of the 7-Eleven, a drunk driver smashed into him at like 65 miles an hour, hit him on the driver's side, and he was killed instantly. And I said, oh my God, it's a horrendous family tragedy. And then I talked to the mother. I said, well, how did your daughter respond to this? And how did you? And what has it been like for you? My God, you poor guys. She said, well, I don't ever really think about my husband. And the mother said that to me. I said, what? You don't think about your husband? No, I really don't. I mean, I dream about him. I said, what's your dream? She said, I have the same dream about him every single night. I said, what is that dream? The dream was that we're sitting at the kitchen table, and he comes in with Italian bread. 10 years have gone by since this happened. For a full decade, according to her, every single night, 7 days a week, 12 months a year, she dreams every night that her husband's coming in with Italian bread. Let me tell you what that tells me. Time stopped for the mother when the husband died. She has not gone on. She's still sitting at the table. Or a deep part of her is still waiting for him to come in and has not dealt with the full magnitude of the tragedy that took place. She seemed not to know that. As she was talking about this a little bit, I thought I saw a tear in her eye, and then the tear disappeared completely from the mother. I said, oh my God. And so I'm having thoughts, and wolfing down this poison food and just filling myself up with it, getting ready to go you-know-where later. And so I said, well, tell me about your daughter. She said, well, my daughter, we were very upset about it, but my daughter, actually what happened with her in the, if you want to call it the aftermath, it's not the aftermath of that, she continued to do really well. She redoubled her efforts in academics, her grades rose. She was very popular, actively involved in social activities and events with other students, and just has really been the light of my life. I said, yeah, but was there extended mourning, grieving? Were there any disturbance at all? None whatsoever. My daughter's been perfect. I thought, oh boy, well that's it then. Because when you have a tragedy like this so bad, a child should show disturbance of some kind. It could take 1,000 forms, but if there's no disturbance at all, it suggests the serious possibility that there has been a massive dissociation of the traumatic loss that has taken place. When a person dissociates trauma, they kind of turn themselves into somebody something didn't really happen to. They go on as if an important event that has taken place just never really occurred. The daughter didn't block it out and have amnesia about her father's death, but emotionally speaking, she appears to have completely canceled out all her feelings. I know about how this can happen because I did essentially the same thing with my mother's death when I lost her at age 8. I'm not going to go into that today, but I know about dissociation, how you can have an emotional dissociation of the impact of something where you know it happened. It's not like you forget it or repress it that it happened. But still in all, you don't go anywhere near those feelings. But when one dissociates the emotional reality of an important event like this, it doesn't go away. It actually lives on within you. And it's really like a ticking time bomb that might just blow open at some later point in life. Whatever chains it down outside of your emotional memory, the chains might break. And then you're flooded by the feeling. So I offered the idea to the mother, Linda, I think your daughter probably has a pathological grief reaction. That's a term for it. Another term, better term, is arrested grief reaction. Pathological, it means it's sick. I don't want to use, that's medical model already when you use a language like that. Arrested grief reaction is fine. That's where you have a loss, and rather than the grieving mourning process unfolding in a way that it needs to, it's blocked completely, maybe dissociated out of a person's mind. I said, how do you know that her whole depression isn't the long delayed reaction to her father's death suddenly surfacing? And then it even occurred to me how maybe the events of her life were coming together so beautifully. That's maybe what triggered it. And in years since, I've wondered whether sitting down and planning the wedding ceremony with her husband-to-be, her fiancé, you know, one part of a wedding ceremony is the father gives away the bride. Is it possible? These are speculations, conjectures, okay? That if she was really thinking about that, did it return into her consciousness the tremendous sadness of the absence of her father? A girl, a young woman, wants her, if he loves her dad, wants her dad present at her wedding. It's an incredibly important symbolic event. You can live without it if you have to, fine. But maybe she couldn't live without it. And maybe she buried the whole thing. There was nothing negative happening in her life, but that doesn't mean that the positive events of her life didn't have a special, unique, phenomenological meaning to her that unleashed a torrent of the dark suffering that had been stored up inside her all this time. So that I was pretty sure this is true. The mother says, no, we think it's an endogenous depression. I said, well, endogenous depression means it's not caused by anything. She said, it's caused by something. It's caused by bad brain chemistry. And what the doctors were doing is taking young people into their inpatient unit in the medical hospital where they were working and trying out various experimental cocktails of antidepressant drugs on them. And what their plan was to just do a careful research trying various combinations of drugs and then finding out the ones that worked the best and then inferring from the drugs that worked to relieve the depression what the underlying neurochemical problem was that started the depression in the first place, that caused this acute endogenous depression of young adulthood. So I told Linda, I said, oh my God. I said, anything's possible. Maybe there is such a thing as a neurochemical screw-up in your brain and it plummets you into a depression. But I happen to know that there's no scientific evidence for a thing like that. That's a belief many people have, but that has not been proven. Anything's possible. But I said anything's possible. But I said, but what if this is not that? It's a delayed grief reaction to the father's death, and that she never dealt with it, and now it's blasting her out of her life. Then if you put her in there and put all these drugs into her, it's not going to help. She might get better for a little while, then she'll get worse, better and worse, better and worse. Why don't you hire somebody to go in there and try to do individual psychotherapy on her and engage her around the topic of her father's death and see if I'm right. And if there's grief and mourning there that has always been blocked, working through that would be the way to deal with this depression. Then if she could grieve and mourn and feel the sadness and cry and cry and cry, you might have a pathway open for a recovery. The mother said, no, we have faith in the psychiatrist. And she yelled at me, actually. And when she said we, the daughter too. The daughter wants nothing to do with psychotherapy, doesn't want to go near it. I started feeling sick at that point, and I honestly don't know whether it was the enchiladas or what she was telling me. It was so upsetting to me because I felt this daughter's life was at risk. Not necessarily that she's going to physically die, but that rather a tragedy is not being addressed. The daughter is herself complicit with the arrangement that this is not being addressed. You know, when people can fall into depressions and not have the slightest idea why they're doing it, and even experience it. The immediate experience is one of being hit by a meteor from space. But it can also be that they don't want to know what it is. I have the theory, and I realize it's a theory, and any theory can be disproven. But my theory is, and I've never seen a case to contradict it, that there are no endogenous depressions. All depression comes from something terribly depressing that has happened. But sometimes there's a great time interval of delay before you see it. Not all depressions occur in a way that the person knows what is depressing him. Sometimes he or she flees from what it's about because it's too painful. And it's a strange thing. Depression itself is such an agony. But sometimes people can be in that agony and not even want to get into the worse agony of what might be producing it in the first place. So I just felt sick about the whole thing. And I pleaded with the mother to consider again what I was talking about. She said, no, no, no. And then I thought further about how she's sitting at that kitchen table waiting for that husband. He's coming in with the Italian bread every single night. And I saw the mother had an arrested grief reaction also. And for her to open up to the idea of her daughter needing to open up her feelings would cause the mother to open up. The whole family seemed really screwed up. Then at that point, I wondered, oh my God, what's going to happen to these people? So I went home, got really sick. I'm not going to bore you with more stories of the porcelain princess. All right. And I lost track of this, but it made a big impression on me. And I wondered what the final outcome of it would be. And I hoped and dreamed that somebody would find a way to connect emotionally with this young woman. And I was afraid of her being the guinea pig of these doctors trying to prove their theories. And when the DSM-5 comes out, by the way, look in it and see if there is something called acute endogenous depression in young adulthood. If there is, they've succeeded, because that's what they wanted to do, was have it recognized and do the basic research for the neurochemistry that might be involved in that. But if I'm right, they're going nowhere, because they're dealing with a fantasy of a depression that has no basis in life experience, and they're going to mess with all these drugs and so on. And what's going to happen to this young woman? Well, it turns out I know what happened to the young woman. Sometimes it's good to live a long time, because then you get to see what really happens later. You don't have to just deal with what happened on that night or that next month or that next year. It's a sad, sad story. Oh my God. Here's the deal. So George goes home and gets sick, recovers, swears he will never have blue crab enchiladas again as long as he lives. And I've carried that out. I have not had them. I'm afraid. Sometimes they say, try the blue crab enchiladas, George, they're really great. No. Nothing to do with it. I almost died the last time. I wanted to die. I understand suicidality. I was there. Except I was too sick to do anything about it. What am I going to do? Drown myself in the toilet? So anyway, 20 years goes by. And I didn't hear anything about it. And I didn't think about it. Once in a while I'd think of it and shudder a little bit about the story of the young woman. Maybe another detail, a few further details kept circling through my mind, elaborating my own hypothesis. Among the many things the woman said was that she was in bed, 22 years old, with this bright future. She can't go anywhere. She said she couldn't move. She felt like there was a heavy weight on top of her. She felt she couldn't catch her breath. It was like she wasn't breathing. She was just like caught in this horrible inertia. And it began to run through my mind, oh my God, maybe I understand what this might be. Is it possible that the loss to her was so massive of her father that she's kind of being her father now? Because he's being crushed under 6 feet of earth. He's buried. And he's not breathing. And I've known other cases where people have a terrible loss and somebody is dead and they're in the ground and they're not breathing. And they kind of form an identification as a way of reacting to the loss with the dead person. So they feel they're dead. They feel they can't move. The dead person can't move. They feel they can't breathe. The dead person's not breathing. Almost like they're being magically in the coffin with the dead one, closing the distance that separates them. Seen that again and again, not in every person, but